Joshua Philipp, welcome.
Hey, pleasure being here.
You described a looming global food crisis, and you've been investigating this topic in quite some depth. Could you explain why you think it's imminent?
Well, right now you have restrictions getting in place in many countries. The United Nations itself has been warning openly that we're facing a global food crisis. They're saying mass starvation. And instead of trying to fix the problem, they're making it worse. They're putting restrictions on nitrates, such as in like the Netherlands right now. They're talking about additional restrictions in New Zealand and Canada. And so the very problem they're saying is causing a food shortage. Rather than fix it, they're making it worse.
And you've described this food crisis as intentionally manufactured. What makes you think it's intentional?
Well, let's put it this way. So right now they're saying that there's going to be a food crisis based on a few different factors. One of the big ones being the war with Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine being the breadbasket of the world, especially to Africa, a lot of countries in Latin America. That is now being lost because not only of the burning of fields, not only because farmers can't farm like they used to, as you'd expect during a war, but also because of some of the blockades set up. Now, in addition to that, other countries, the Netherlands, second largest food producer in the world, or exporter in the world, now facing restrictions are going to shut down farms. Now, you take this and multiply it across the different countries that have used similar policies, not to mention other issues countries are facing from floods, from COVID, from shipping crisis, shutting things down. You're looking at a real big crisis. Now, given that crisis we're all facing, again, rather than fixing it, countries like the Netherlands right now, like Canada is trying to do right now, like American shipping companies are doing right now, rather than fix the problem, they're implementing policies that are going to make it worse because they're restricting fertilizers, they're restricting transportation of fertilizers, and they're going after farmers.
And what do you think would fix the problem?
What would fix the problem, I believe, would be to, I'd say, reduce the pressure on farmers rather than make their lives harder. If we're facing a global food crisis, what you need is more farming, not less farming. And the policies they're putting in place mean less farming. Not only that, but they should be, for example, making sure that shipments work properly, making it so train companies in the United States cannot restrict the shipment of fertilizers. They should be making it so fertilizers can be used really freely, at least during this time of crisis, at least for the next 2 years, as long as, again, the breadbasket of a lot of Latin America and a lot of Africa, Ukraine, is able to produce again normally. Until at least that happens, they should be helping farmers, not harming and restricting farmers.
You've described what's happening in Sri Lanka as the canary in the coal mine. Could you explain more about what's happening there?
Well, a couple of years ago, Sri Lanka put into place policies that mirror what is now being done in a lot of other countries. One example would be Canada trying to put restrictions on what they call chemical fertilizers, like what they're doing in New Zealand with restrictions on chemical fertilizers, trying to do. They're not fully through yet. In Sri Lanka, they wanted to go purely organic, which great. I love organic food. I eat organic food typically as well. I love it. The problem is you can't transition from one day to the next and expect the soil to be able to handle it. You also can't expect to get enough supplies to be able to handle it. And what happens, they had a huge crop failure, massive crop failure, and they became reliant on imports from other countries. Now, that had a ripple effect through the economy. And we're seeing now that Sri Lanka has become a failed state. They just had a huge raid, a huge mass protest in the presidential palace. The prime minister fled by boat. And right now the economy is collapsing and they don't have enough food to feed themselves because of the same policies implemented there a couple years ago that countries in other parts of the world are now beginning to implement.
And how could what's happening in the Netherlands and Sri Lanka impact the U.S.?
Well, the United States typically would be okay in the face of a famine. The United States is pretty insulated. We're a very unique country in terms of our ability to take care of ourselves without really needing much of the world. The problem we have in the United States, though, is one, we're in a globalized market. And so there's not restrictions on food leaving the United States to other countries, meaning that other countries, if they're facing food crisis and rising food prices, we are going to face food crisis and rising food prices unless there are restrictions on exports, none of which is happening. The other big thing in the U.S. is the shipping crisis. rising gas prices, rising cost of shipping, different problems, for example, with diesel engines and the ability to move food around. In addition to that, we also have a lot of train issues as well, right? Because again, the shipping crisis is affecting the trains, and there are restrictions such as companies not transporting fertilizers. And so while the U.S. would not normally be facing a crisis, we are facing a crisis because, again, of these policies.
As you mentioned, many countries around the world are restricting nitrogen, and many of them have said that it's in the name of trying to tackle global warming or climate change. Could you speak to that a little?
Yeah, so one of the big arguments with nitrates is that it's an environmental problem. Actually, the restrictions on nitrates began really around 2006 to 2008. 2006 roughly in a lot of parts of the world, 2008 under Obama in the United States. At the time, 2006, 2008, it was regarded more as a terrorist threat because there was a concern people would make explosives using nitrates, fertilizer, and so on. There were some major terrorist texts that you did use weapons like that, homemade weapons. Now, that narrative, of course, put the control of fertilizer under the government. The government can then regulate fertilizer. That has now been expanded upon the new narrative, which is, first of all, global warming, then climate change. And so it's the same thing continuing under a different banner. Now, in terms of the environmental impact of fertilizer, there are, of course, more sustainable ways to do it. The problem you have is this. If you want to transition from chemical fertilizer directly to organic fertilizer, the soil itself needs a transition process to go from, again, being heavily reliant on chemical fertilizer to something that, again, the plants themselves are not used to. The soil can't handle it. And I know there's people warning that if you switch from one to the next on day one, that's like someone with a chemical addiction trying to just, go cold turkey the next day. They're going to die sometimes. And right now, what they're doing with the crops and with the soil, if you switch from one to the other on day one and you don't go through a transition process, which should take several years, not one day, yeah, you're going to have like Dust Bowl type scenarios. You're going to destroy the soil, you're going to have crop failures, and you're going to have famine.
Joshua Philipp, senior investigative journalist with the Epoch Times, thank you so much.
Hey, pleasure. Thank you.